Hi, I'm Laura Flanders, and I'm here with Noam Chomsky, Professor Emeritus here at MIT in Philosophy and Linguistics, author of countless books. Most recently, well, there's a collection of columns, Making the Future, and a new open pamphlet called Occupy. Noam, let's start with big picture. How would you characterize this moment, historically speaking?
Well, there is depending on how you look at it, either a crisis or a return to the norm of stagnation. There's two views of this. One view is the norm is stagnation, occasionally you get out of it, and the other is the norm is growth, and occasionally you get into stagnation, so you can debate that. But anyway, it's a period of pretty close to global stagnation, a striking shift from production to financialization. The United States and Europe are committing suicide in different ways, but both doing it. In Europe, it's austerity in the midst of recession, which is guaranteed to be a disaster and is one. There's some resistance to that now. In the United States, it's offshoring of production and financialization and getting rid of the superfluous population by incarceration, things like that. And there seems to be no easy way out of this.
How about politically? How would you characterize where we're at?
Politically, there's, again, there are differences. In Europe, there's a dangerous growth of ultranationalist, xenophobic movements, which is pretty threatening, especially anyone who remembers the history of Europe. And there's an attack on the remnants of the welfare state. In fact, it's pretty hard to interpret the austerity in the midst of recession policies other than as an attack on the social contract. In fact, some of the leaders come out and pretty much say it. In the United States, it's first of all, the electoral system has been almost totally shredded. Now, for a long time, it's been pretty much run by private concentrated spending, but now it's kind of like over the top. The Republican Party has, for some years, pretty much abandoned any pretense of being a traditional political party. It's in kind of lockstep obedience to very rich, super rich corporate sector. They can't get votes that way, so they've had to mobilize a different constituency, which has always been there through American history, but rarely was mobilized politically. They call it the religious right, but it's basically the extreme religious population. The United States is off the spectrum in religious commitment and anti-abortion, opposed to women's rights. So they've had to appeal to that and to the nativist population, the people who are frightened. It's a very frightened country. And, you know, it's increasing now by the recognition that the white population is going to be a minority pretty soon, so they're taking our country from us. And that's the Republicans. There are no more moderate Republicans. They're now the centrist Democrats, because the Democrats are drifting to the right after them. The Democrats have pretty much given up on the white working class. They don't even try. That would require commitment to economic issues, and that's not their concern.
Do you think comparisons between Occupy and the Arab Spring are misplaced? Useful?
One point of similarity is they're both responses to the toll taken by the neoliberal programs. So in Egypt, the neoliberal programs have meant statistical growth. Like right before the Arab Spring, Egypt was a kind of poster child of the World Bank and the IMF, the marvelous economic management, great reforms. The only problem is that for most of the population, it was kind of like a blow in the solar plexus. The wages going down, benefits being eliminated, subsidized food gone, and meanwhile, high concentration of wealth and a huge amount of corruption. Well, okay, we have kind of an analog to that here. It kind of stimulated the Occupy movement, and there's interactions.
In the media coverage of the Occupy movement, there was a tremendous confusion between those who talked about the need for demands and those who talked about anarchism and the question of organization, as if these were all kind of contradictory, that you couldn't be both anarchistic and have organization. Can you clarify some of this for us? Is there a contradiction between anarchism and organization?
No, well, you know, anarchism means all sorts of things to different people, but actually when this media confusion, I think, has a basis, because there really are two different strands in the Occupy movement, and both important but different. One is sort of policy-oriented. So what policy goals do we want to achieve? You know, regulate the banks, get money out of elections, raise the minimum wage, and a whole environmental issues, the whole variety of policy issues, all very important. And the Occupy movement made a difference. It shifted the not only discourse, but even to some extent action on these issues. The other part is just creating communities, something extremely important in a country like this, which is very atomized. People don't talk to each other. You know, you're alone with your television set or internet or whatever it is.
Why is that so important?
Because you can't have a functioning democracy without what sociologists call secondary organizations, places where people can get together, plan, talk, develop ideas. You know, you don't do it alone. The Occupy movement did create spontaneously communities that taught people something. You can be in a supportive community of mutual aid and cooperation, and you can have an open space for democratic discussion and participation. Communities like that are really important. And that's, I think, maybe what's causing the media confusion, because it's both.
Do you think that's why the media found it so important to the same media that disregard violence against women and violence against people of color all the time, found it so important to emphasize stories of alleged rape and violence?
Yeah, that's standard. I mean, every popular movement that they want to denigrate is, you pick those things. That's what they're looking for. Let's try to show that it's silly and insignificant and violent, if possible. To pay attention to the actual core of the movement, that would be pretty hard.
Dr. King called it the beloved community.
Yeah, and a community of real participation. And that always gets smashed. So take, say, Martin Luther King. I mean, when you listen to the speeches on Martin Luther King Day, it's all about, I have a dream, and so on. But he had another dream, the one that he presented in his last talk in Memphis, just before he was assassinated, and which he said something about how he's like Moses. You know, you can see the promised land, but we're not going to get there. And the promised land was policies and developments which would deal with the poverty and repression and not race, but in fact he was organizing a poor people's movement. Well, right after that, right after the assassination, there was a march. He was going to lead it. King led it. And they had a tent city, Resurrection Park, and the security forces were called in by the Liberal Congress. This is the most liberal Congress in memory. They broke in the middle of the night, smashed up Resurrection City, and drove them out of the city. That's the way you deal with popular movements that are threatening.
Thinking of Memphis, Dr. King was there in support of striking sanitation workers,
Correct.
Whose famous slogan was, "I am a man." And I'd love your thoughts on the future of the labor movement.
Private sector unionization is down to practically 7%. Meanwhile, the public sector unions have sustained themselves. They've been under attack, but they've kind of sustained themselves. The last 2 or 3 years have been a sharp attack on public sector unions, which Obama has participated in fact. So when you freeze salaries of federal workers, that's equivalent to taxing public service people.
Denying the right to collective bargaining in Wisconsin.
In Wisconsin, and a whole range of attacks. Because that's the part of the labor movement which was protected by the legal system. It's kind of like a residue of the New Deal and Great Society and so on. It's a constant battle right through American history. the history of every other country too, but the United States happens to have an unusually violent labor history. I mean, hundreds of workers were getting killed here for organizing and so on at a time when that was just unheard of in Europe or Australia.
Today, there are so many targets to choose from. In Dr. King's day or in the 30s, the targets were labor rights or civil rights, judiciary, the courts, Congress. Today, where's the number one target of power in your sense, in your view? Is it corporations we should be going after? Is it Congress? Is it the Pentagon? Is it the media? Who's the linchpin?
First of all, the media are corporations. So, it's the concentrations of private power, which have an enormous, not total control, but enormous influence over Congress and the White House. In fact, that's increasing sharply with the sharp concentration of private power, the escalating cost of elections, and so on.
Well, for example, as we're speaking, there are shareholder actions happening in San Francisco, in Detroit. Are those good targets?
They're okay, but remember, there's no economic principle that says that management should be responsive to shareholders. In fact, you can read in texts of business economics that, well, you could just as well have a system in which the management is responsible to stakeholders. Stakeholders, meaning workers and community, why not? Why shouldn't they be responsible? Of course, this presupposes that there ought to be management, but that's another question. Why should there be management? Why not have the stakeholders run the industry?
Well, this is a phenomenon that's growing.
It is,
I'm following it. I know that you are. Gaurav Paravitz has written about it. Worker co-ops appearing across Ohio, Pennsylvania, right here where we are now. One question that I hear is, will change come from changing ownership, even to worker ownership, if you don't change the profit paradigm? Could you maintain the same kind of exploitative profit system under worker ownership? It's
a little bit like asking whether shareholder voting is a good idea. Yeah, it's a step. Is the Buffett rule a good idea? Yeah, a small step. I mean, worker ownership within a state capitalist market, semi-market system is better than private ownership, but it has inherent problems. I mean, markets have well-known inherent inefficiencies. They're just part of markets. They're very destructive. I mean, the obvious one is that in a market system, a really functioning one, whoever's making the decisions doesn't pay attention to what are called externalities, effects on others. So say, I sell you a car, where our eyes are open, we'll make a good deal for ourselves, but we're not asking how it's going to affect her. And it will. There'll be more congestion, more gas prices will go up, environmental effects and so on. And that multiplies over the whole population. Well, that's pretty serious. Take, say, financial crises. Ever since New Deal regulation was essentially dismantled, there have been regular financial crises. And one of the fundamental reasons it's understood is the fact that, say, the CEO of Goldman Sachs or Citigroup or whatever does not pay attention to what's called systemic risk. So maybe you make a risky investment transaction and you cover your own potential losses, but you don't take into account the fact that if it crashes, it may crash the system, which is what a financial crash is. So, and the much more serious case of this is environmental effects. Now, in the case of financial institutions, when they crash, the taxpayer comes to the rescue. But if you destroy the environment, nobody's going to come to the rescue.
So, sounds like you'd support things like the Cleveland model, where the ownership of the company is actually held by a NGO representing the community as well as workers.
That's a step forward, but it also has to go beyond that to dismantle the system of production for profit rather than production for use. And that means, dismantling at least large parts of market systems. Take the most advanced case, Mondragon. It's worker-owned. It's It's not worker managed, actually, although the management does come from the workforce often. They exploit workers in South America, you know, they do things that are harmful to the society as a whole and so on, and have no choice. I mean, if you're in a system where you must make profit in order to survive, you're compelled to ignore negative externalities, effects on others. That's only one example. And market systems also have a very bad, just kind of psychological effect. I mean, they drive people to a conception of themselves and society in which you're only after your own good, you know, not others, and that's extremely harmful.
Have you ever felt, tasted, had a sense of a non-market system? Have you ever had a flash of optimism? Oh, this is how we could live.
So it certainly can be done. And the biggest I know is Mondragon, but there are many in between. I mean, a functioning family, for example. And there are bigger groups, you know, cooperatives are case in point. Right here in Boston, there's one of the suburbs about 2 years ago, I guess. There was a small but profitable enterprise building some kind of high-tech equipment for airplanes or something. The multinational who owned it didn't want to keep it on the books. It was profitable, but bother. So they decided to close it down. The workforce and the union, it was UE, offered to buy it. The community was supportive. It could have worked if there had been popular support. If there had been an Occupy movement then, I think that would have been a great thing for them to concentrate on. If it had worked, you would have had one of, there are many of them, profitable worker-owned, maybe worker-managed enterprises. There's a fair amount of that around the country, and there are real examples. I don't see why they shouldn't survive. Of course, they're going to be beaten back. You know, the power systems are not going to want them any more than they want popular democracy, any more than the states in the Middle East and the West are going to tolerate the Arab Spring. They're going to try to beat it back.
They tried to beat back those sit-in strikes that you talked about early on. What we forget is entire communities showed up to support those workers, get food in there, make sure they were protected, including women, as I recall, big cordons of women protecting them from the cops.
Go back a century to Homestead, you know, the worker-run communities, towns, that send in the National Guard to destroy them.
2 minutes from you on the role of racial violence and the racial discrimination in this situation we've been describing. Some people think it's sometimes economic issues or civil rights and race issues.
Well, you know, there clearly is a serious race problem in the country. So, for example, wealth in African-American communities is almost zero. The history is striking. You take a look at the history of African-Americans in the United States. There's been about 30 years of relative freedom. It was a decade after the Civil War, and before, you know, the North-South Compact essentially recriminalized black life. During the Second World War, there was a need for free labor, so there was a kind of a freeing up of the labor force. Blacks benefited from it. It lasted for about 20 years. The big growth period in the 50s and the 60s, very high growth. So, you know, a black man could get a job in an auto plant and buy a house and send his kids to college. And it kind of entered into the world. But by the 70s, that was over. Basically, the workforce, which is partly white, but also heavily black, they became superfluous. And look at what happened. We recriminalized black life. The incarceration rate since about 1980s gone through the roof. It's overwhelmingly black males. And it's essentially redoing what happened after Reconstruction. And that's the history of African Americans. How can anyone say there's no race issue? I mean,
talk about media for a few minutes. We can often discern the bias in the telling of an individual story, but I want you to talk more broadly about the way that our corporate media portrays power, democracy, the role of the individual, the way that change happens.
the way the change, well, they don't want change to happen. I mean, they're right in the center of the system of power and domination. First of all, they are corporations, parts of bigger corporations. They're very closely linked with other systems of power, both in personnel and interests and social background and everything else. So that naturally tend to be pretty rather reactionary.
I mean, they kind of give us a clock. If it hasn't happened in 5 minutes, it's not going to happen.
Well, that's a technique of indoctrination. I mean, it's something I learned about through my own experience. There was once an interview with Jeff Greenfield, I think. He was asked in the interview why I was never invited onto their program. It was one of the famous...
Nightline.
Nightline, yeah. And he gave a good answer. He said his main reason is I lack concision. I had never heard that word before. But you have to have concision. You have to say something brief between two commercials. I can say Iran is a terrible state. I don't need any evidence. Libya, Gaddafi carried out terror, okay. Suppose I try to say the United States carries out terror. In fact, it's one of the leading terrorist states in the world. You can't say that between two commercials. People rightly want to know what you mean. I never heard that before. And then you have to explain, and you have to give some background. And that's exactly what's cut out. So concision is a technique of propaganda. It ensures that you cannot do anything except either repeat cliches, standard doctrine, or else sound like a lunatic.
And what about power? The media's picture of power. Who has it, who doesn't have it? And what's our role in a democracy if we're not, say, president or CEO?
Well, not just the media, but it's pretty much true of scholarship and the academic world. The differences are not huge. The picture is we're the leading democracy in the world, the beacon of freedom and rights and democracy. The fact that democratic participation is extremely marginal doesn't enter. I mean, the media will condemn the elections in Iran rightly because the candidates have to be vetted by the clerics. They don't point out that in the United States they have to be vetted by high concentrations of private capital. You can't run an election unless you can, collect billions of dollars and so on. This happens to be the 50th anniversary of the U.S. invasion of South Vietnam. Now that was the worst atrocity in the post-war period. Killed millions of people, destroyed 4 countries. I mean, total horror story. It was not a word. It didn't happen because we did it, so it didn't happen. Take, say, 9/11. That means something in the United States. The world changed after 9/11. Well, just do a slight thought experiment. I suppose that on 9/11, the planes had bombed the White House, which maybe one of them was trying to do. I suppose they'd killed the president, established a military dictatorship, quickly killed thousands of people, tortured tens of thousands, set up a major international terror center that was carrying out assassinations, overthrowing governments all over the place, installing other dictatorships and so on, drove the country into one of the worst depressions in its history. I suppose that had happened. It did happen on the first 9/11. 9/11, 1973. Except we were responsible for it, so therefore it didn't happen. That's Allende's Chile. In fact, in Latin America, they call it the first 9/11. Well, you can't imagine the media talking about this, and you can generalize it broadly. So in some respects, critique of the media is a little misleading because it's not very different from the mainstream intellectual community, the elite media, that is, and they closely interact with them. They're pretty much the same people.
Well, that's why we're always glad to talk to you, Professor Chomsky. What a pleasure.
Yeah.
You've been watching Noam Chomsky, me, Laura Flanders, for Free Speech TV.